central component, a major component to all sensory systems except the olfactory, and even it has some elements of this, is a topography. Topography means that as you move across some collection of neurons, you move across sensory space. Now, how do you get one of those? Well, let's look at the basilar membrane. We're going to come back to this later, but the basilar membrane at its base is of a certain width and very stiff. And as you move toward its apex, the basilar membrane is 2.5 times the width that it was at the base, and is considerably floppier. And the end result of that is that this part, the base of the basilar membrane, where you find hair cells, those are where the hair cells are found. You don't have 3 of them; you've got thousands of them. That where they sit is going to determine the frequency to which they respond. And so that a hair cell that sits very close to the base will respond to relatively high frequencies. Humans respond all the way up to 20 kilohertz, so 16 is a high frequency. Whereas neurons that are sitting down here by the apex are going to respond to low frequencies. Humans respond to about 20 hertz, or 20 cycles per second. 1 kilohertz is 1,000 cycles per second. So a hair cell responding to 20 hertz is going to be way down here at the very apex of the basilar membrane. What all of this means is that where the hair cell is, its place will determine what it responds to. We call that a place code, where the location of a cell tells you what it responds to. Well, that place code continues nicely into the spiral ganglion, because what happens is each spiral ganglion cell talks to the nearest hair cell. And so where the spiral ganglion cell is will determine the frequency to which it responds, because that's the hair cell that it talks to. This particular spiral ganglion cell will respond to 16 kilohertz because it talks to a hair cell that responds to 16 kilohertz. Similarly, this cell responds to 4 kilohertz and this to 1 because they innervate hair cells that respond thusly. Now the axons of all of those guys are going to form the 8th nerve, or at least the acoustic branch of the 8th nerve. And then notice the axons from each of these ganglion cells is now terminating in an orderly fashion, so that if we put another ganglion cell here, that was going out and talking to this piece of basilar membrane hair cells there, it would terminate somewhere in between these other two, because there's a topography. We're going from 1 to 2 to 3. Similarly here we're going 1 to 2 to 3. We call that kind of projection, where neighboring cells talk to neighboring places in a target, a topographic projection. So once the place code has been established by the hair cells along the basilar membrane, it's maintained by the spiral ganglion cells and their locations and their projections, their axons then, that go into the cochlear nuclei. Because those projections are topographic, what you then have is a topographic projection, a topographic representation of the sensory surface, so that high frequencies would be down here and low frequencies would be up there. And that's what you get. Again, it's a place code that's continued along from hair cell to spiral ganglion cell to then the cochlear nuclei. Topographic projections then persist from the cochlear nuclei. And so neighboring cells here would wind up sending axons to neighboring regions, and for example the inferior colliculus. Good. And then those cells would wind up sending topographic projections to neighboring cells in the medial geniculate. And then they, in the medial geniculate, wind up sending topographic projections to primary auditory cortex. And so here we are in the primary auditory area. It is buried in a large fissure, and that fissure is called the lateral fissure. Here it's called lateral sulcus. Sulcus and fissure we can think of as being synonymous. And if you pry open the lateral fissure and you look on the lower bank of the lateral fissure, what do you notice? There you find the primary auditory area in humans. And it's organized tonotopically, so that here at its rostral extreme would be the representation of 20 hertz, and way back here at its caudal extreme is the representation of 20 kilohertz. And so there is then a tonotopic representation of tones. And it's tonotopic, so that as you go from one place to the next, in each of these auditory structures, you go from one frequency to the next. That's a critical element to auditory processing. This place code makes sure that a neuron, when it becomes active, is capable of providing information as to what the frequency of sound is. Because when that neuron responds, it responds only when that frequency of sound is available, has been presented. And so it's able to tell the rest of the central nervous system that that frequency of sound is present out there in the auditory periphery.